So.
Hi. Hello. Hi, Taro.
Dear panelists, for the screening, we ask you to speak very close to the mic, even though you
can't
very
hear it.
Janet, but Rory, I will switch with you. You will have this place, but I just want to say to you everything. And then I change the
Your show.
I show the statement.
It's nice to see the history.
Say that.
I was saying about. I decided on the.
Yeah.
Yes.
Poderia até falar em português.
Bora ver. Muito prazer.
E a Diana também fala português.
Português? That's okay.
Certo.
It's not always that you have four Portuguese speakers in the panel.
Português.
Oh, yeah, é brasileira.
Yeah.
So, Mr. Special Rapporteur is not in the room. So just before we are going on, we have the audience online, so I will kindly ask the speakers to speak close to the mic.
Sorry.
So we are now officially launching this event. Excellencies, dear colleagues, good afternoon to who is with us here at the Bonn World Conference Center. And good morning, good afternoon, or good evening to who is now watching the video of this event. We have the pleasure to welcome you today for a side event to the 5th International Conference on Chemicals Management, organized by the United Nations Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, the Special Rapporteur on Toxics and Human Rights, the United Nations Environment Programme. So I don't want to miss anybody, so this is why I'm carefully looking at the screen I have in front of me. The International Labour Organization, the United Nations Economic Commission for Europe, the International Trade Union Confederation, and the International Pollutants to Eliminate Network. And indeed, I was about to miss my own organization, which is the UNEP-led Geneva Environment Network. The event today builds on the landmark resolutions adopted last year and this year at the General Assembly, at the United Nations Environment Assembly, at the International Labour Conference, and at the World Health Assembly. The adoption of these landmark resolutions is an important step in securing the enjoyment for all people of non-toxic environments in which to live, work, study, and play, and ensuring inclusive, evidence-based, and accountable environmental action. Our event today will explore these recent developments and identify key entry points to strengthen the human rights-based approach for a post-2020 chemicals and waste strategy. Our session today will be moderated by Ana Paula de Souza from the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, where she leads the work on human rights and the pollution cluster. And before I hand over to Ana Paula, I would like to remind everybody that the documents presented, the summary, as well as the video of the event, will be made available on the webpage of this event, and you must have on the screen the link where you can access this. This is a question that we keep receiving, so I keep repeating this at all our events. And with that, Ana Paula, over to you.
Thank you so much, Diana, for the introduction. We were talking amongst ourselves, is like, there are so many negotiations going on now. This is a key moment of the process, and basically we had the great idea of getting all the best human rights champions in a panel instead of being there in the negotiating rooms inputting. So there is no taking mistake will not happen again. But that's what we have here. We have a group of, I am so humbled to be sitting next to this panel today, and you're going to see why when the interventions start to come. And I would like really this to be like an informal conversation, and at any point, let's say after I speak or Marcus speak or any other panelist speaks, if anyone in the audience wants to pose a question or have a comment, please just raise your hand. Let's make this really like a conversation, coming up with specific proposals on how can we make sure human rights remain central in all the discussions here today until the end of the week. But I was trying not to make a speech, but from everything that I've heard this week, I felt inspired to share some words. Be short, so please bear with me. In 2006, states committed to respecting human rights and fundamental freedoms, understanding and respecting ecosystem integrity, and addressing the gap between the current reality and our ambition to elevate global efforts to achieve the sound management of chemicals. That is the language of the Dubai Declaration. 17 years on, toxic chemicals continue to be responsible for ongoing massive human rights harms that negatively affect multiple aspects of human life and dignity. The air we breathe, the food we eat, the water we drink, indeed our health, well-being, and survival all depend on a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment. There can no longer be any doubt that a human right to a healthy environment exists. That is part of the interconnected and interdependent goal of human rights law, and that it must be respected, protected, and fulfilled by all states for all people. But what does it mean? What does the recognition of the right to a healthy environment mean for us all? First of all, recognition of the right to a healthy environment empowers all people with a critical tool to hold their governments, big polluters, and all those responsible for environmental harm to account. Time and again, we see that it's the people who are already in vulnerable situations that disproportionately suffer from the human rights impacts of pollution, nature loss, and climate change that need recourse. But the word recognition is significant here. Human rights may be recognized by governments, but they do not come from the government. They are rights we have simply because we exist as human beings. They are inherent to us all. Broader recognition simply creates better conditions for action and accountability. And it's important because the state of our environment today is in crisis. Let's be clear, all states already have obligations to respect, protect, and fulfill human rights. This extended to protecting people from foreseeable and preventable human rights harms caused by all forms of environmental degradation. What we are discussing here, and hear me, at ICCM 5, and what should be the focus of all multilateral negotiations is how to achieve that. Any other discussion is a distraction. Recognition also supports accountability of duty bearers, including states and business. This right is our moral compass at a time where the catastrophic impacts of corporate greed and unsustainable, unprincipled management of chemicals has been documented so thoroughly that there is no longer any doubt to the extent to which we are undermining our common future unless we immediately put on the brakes. We need the international community to act with single-minded purpose and solidarity to deploy every possible resource to protect and fulfill the human right to health. Failure to rise to this challenge is not an option. At ICCM 5, states must confront the serious global chemicals and waste crisis and commit to a higher level of ambition, articulating a vision to protect human health and the environment that is grounded in human rights. On that note, I would like to ask Marcos Orellana, who is the UN Special Rapporteur on Toxic Human Rights, if you could elaborate on how the human rights-based approach can help us tackling the toxic crisis. What shift is needed to ensure we put brakes to the toxification of the planet? Over to you.
Thank you very much, Ana Paula. Thank you for convening and organizing this panel. I'm very pleased to be with you here today. My name is Marcos Orellana. I'm the United Nations Special Rapporteur on Toxics and Human Rights. And in answer to your question, I wish to elaborate on the human rights-based approach and a specific aspect of this approach, which is its focus on persons, groups, peoples in vulnerable situation. We often speak about a human rights-based approach, but what is it? And plainly, human rights-based approach calls for consideration of all human rights issues that are relevant in a given situation, and that includes principles, it includes norms, and it includes the range of issues that arise. Sometimes it's said, well, is this approach in opposition to other approaches? And here I want to perhaps underscore as the first point, the ability of the human rights-based approach to synergize with other approaches such as risk management or market-based approaches. So it's not either or. Human rights-based approach sets a baseline of respect to individuals and groups. But today, in the few minutes that I have, I wish to focus on a specific aspect of the human rights-based approach, and that is the focus on persons and groups in vulnerable situations. Perhaps let's look at this as we approach the 75th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights this coming 10th of December, is to recall that this declaration set a standard of achievement for humanity, a promise of a world free of fear and want, a vision where no one is left behind. And that begins to explain why the focus on those who suffer, on those who experience abuse or violations of their dignity. The mandate on toxics and human rights that I currently hold, that has been created by the Human Rights Council, has for many years adopted this approach to dealing with chemicals and wastes. My predecessor in the mandate, for example, prepared dedicated thematic reports on the rights of workers. He prepared principles on workers that the Human Rights Council took note of. This is a very important document after extensive consultation. He also prepared a thematic report on the rights of children. There have been numerous actors involved in the interface and discussions on children and the environment, and it is very welcome to see that earlier this year, the Committee on the Rights of the Child, which is the entity that oversees compliance and monitors implementation with the Convention on the Rights of the Child, released a general comment on children's rights and the environment. This document explicitly regards the right to a healthy environment as included in the Children's Rights Convention. It's implicit in this convention, and it is directly linked to the rights to life, the right to health, the right to an adequate standard of living, education. It speaks, the general comment speaks, again, specifically on the duty to closely regulate toxic substances, especially developmental neurotoxins. In my tenure, I have also focused on persons and groups in vulnerable situations in thematic reports. Last year, I presented to the UN General Assembly a report on indigenous peoples and toxics. It chronicled, among other things, historical patterns and experience of discrimination. And I've been very pleased to see how some of the recommendations are already being acted upon, such as the opening for review of the Food and Agriculture Organizations and the World Health Organization's Code of Conduct on International Pesticide Management, so that it can align itself with the standards in the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Next year, 2024, I'm already preparing a report on women and toxics, so the structural marginalization, so structures of power, decision-making, also economic spheres. Consultations have been had on the Commission on the Status of Women at the most recent Conference of the Parties of Basel, Washington, Stockholm. Consultations will take place at the UN Environment Assembly and elsewhere. So to begin closing, the rights-based approach, it involves values of solidarity in the shaping of norms. It also involves self-awareness. It involves empathy, which is, I will argue, one of the defining features of what makes us human, self-awareness and empathy. It also involves action, and action to enhance visibility, to address specific issues and vulnerabilities, and to elaborate special measures of protection to overcome a legacy and experience of discrimination. So in the end, chemicals and waste instruments face a strong challenge of changing direction and to become fit to overcome the global chemicals emergency. And the human rights-based approach offers the tools to do this, to move us to a chemically safe circular economy. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Marcus, for reminding us that we should not work in silence, that human rights is not either or, the human rights is the baseline for action, and for reminding us so well about who pays the price, a high price, I must say, because they pay the price with their health and life, due to actions that basically are meant, humankind. Anyway, I would like to move now to Santos Virgilio from the Ministry of Environment of Angola. He's focal point for SAICM and facilitator for the Africa group here at ICCM 5. ICCM 5 is a major milestone to confront the global chemicals and waste crisis, and it's fair to say that we need a strong SAICM beyond 2020 for protecting human and environmental health. Are we ready to move to a binding no voluntary approach? This is a discussion worth having at this moment in time. And what are your hopes, expectations, and perhaps even fears for the new instrument for the international chemicals and waste management? If you could actually add another question. From your perspective, what does environmental justice means in this context?
Yeah, thank you. First of all, when it comes to human rights, the wording and the concept comes from the north. And countries like mine, and especially African countries, are always, when it comes to report and to say, okay, are the countries where the human rights are not respected because governments don't create laws, a lot of things that have been arising. And I think it's better here to talk about human rights and chemicals, the harm of chemicals and waste on the human rights, is to focus on the concept that we got from the north. Because the north are the countries that respect human rights, respect everything. But in this case of chemicals, we have to call up to the north to revisit their concept of human rights, or maybe the concept of humanity. Who is considered human being, which is not, who is not considered human being? Are we the human being according to the concept of the north the same? I think we first of all need to answer this question. Then after having the answers to those questions, then we go to the chemicals and see how the chemicals are also a question of human rights. And in the constitution of my country said, okay, every single citizen has rights of a clean and healthy environment. That's the basics. Now, how to assure that is observed and everybody has the rights? That's been the challenge. But coming to ICCM 5, during the intersessional process, we have been emphasizing that if we take ourselves in this global village, which is the planet Earth that we are living, we know that we are not at the same level of knowledge, the same level of development, the same level of resources. But we agree all that problems affecting one part of the world will soon or late influence the other part of the globe. So that's why we emphasize one of the most important rights when we're talking about chemicals is the information, sharing of information. Because chemicals are produced in few countries, but are used worldwide. But the difference, what's the difference? The difference, okay, those who are producing most of the chemicals, they have the information about the risks of the products they're putting in the market. And most of the countries, most of the people, we are the consumers, the traders. Sometimes we don't have the information about the products we're using, the product we're trading. Start from there. There is no available information for everybody. And even when that information is available, there is no transparency in terms of supplying the adequate information to people. So if we are in that point of situation, surely we don't have the rights of having that information, the right of deciding for using or not this or that product. It's not given to people. So take or take, so we just take it, we use anyhow. We don't know even how to handle the product properly. And if something unexpected occurs, we don't have the means to deal with that one, even for trying to rescue some damages or to face the situation created. So this is the point of view. And since I'm here as African, we came here with a clear message that okay, we need to deal with chemicals. Chemicals are already with us, we're living with them. Most of them are dangerous, but we don't have enough information of how to deal with those chemicals. And we don't have also the means. Even if we know how to deal with them, we don't have the means to get ourselves back safe from those dangerous products. And as I said yesterday, we are coming also from a past. We're being colonized. And colonization is not a good thing. Colonialists don't respect people. Colonialists don't treat well people they find. So we are left with that legacy. And they left also chemicals in the farms and some other. There are a lot of stockpiles in our countries. So we inherited that legacy that we. Now the world is asking us to deal with them. We didn't create them, and we are obliged to deal with them. So how are we going to do that? The only way to do that is we have solidarity. We have compromise from those who created the problems in our countries. We are not coming here to blame for any political or whatever. We're here like from our deep hearts, we are claiming in the desert. Okay, we are here, we are human beings like you. We have rights to be alive and to live a proper life. So give us the information. Share the resources that most of the resources were taken from our territories. Share the profit you are making with us to allow us to deal with the problems you created to us. We're not asking to come and solve our problems, but give us the resources to solve the problems, most of them created by yourselves. So when we are talking about human rights, we have to recognize that we're not all at the same level of information. So we cannot be asked to have the same responsibility, because some of us have more responsibility than the others. If you don't recognize this one, there's no way that you can talk about human rights. I think it's the point.
Thank you very much. You brought so many elements in this intervention. Thank you for starting the reflection of what we understand by humanity. And I've seen you yesterday at the plenary referring to the Ubuntu, the theology, philosophy in Africa, and that we have a shared existence in this planet. Human rights, some of the principles of human rights that tend to be forgotten, and I wish the South would remember it a bit more, is the principle of progressive realization of rights. Some rights, of course, are of immediate obligation, like to not kill, to not arbitrary executions, let's not discriminate, let's not enslave. For example, other rights require resources, and for those, you have to show that there is progress. So it's the progressive realization that also includes the non-retrogressivity, but also human rights imposes an obligation of cooperation amongst countries. Thank you also for shedding light on the right to access to information. I would like to add to that also the right to everyone to enjoy the benefits of science. Both rights also imply an exchange of, cooperation. And thank you for closing up with a call for solidarity, especially from those who have created the problems we are. So thank you for those reflections. Sometimes I know if anyone from the audience has any questions at any point, please do not hesitate to raise your hands. I'd like now to turn to Joaquim Nunes, who is the Chief of the Labor Administration, Labor Inspection and Occupational Safety and Health Branch of the Governance and Tripartism Department of the International Labour Organization. What a title. So the ILO estimates that death of 1 million workers each year as a result of exposure to hazardous chemicals, which is one death every 30 seconds. Hundreds of millions more lose their health. In June 2022, the ILC, the International Labour Conference, adopted a resolution on the right to a safe and healthy working environment, and in 2023 on just transition. As we gather here today, how could the ILC resolutions inform the new global approach, especially concerning occupational safety and health and just transition? Over to you, Joaquim.
Thank you so much, Ana Paula. So first of all, I'm going to speak a bit of the ILO's concerns and hopes for the future. Our concern, well, we just said it, Ana Paula, 1 million workers dying every year because of exposure to occupation. Is that we are sitting here, around 14,000 workers will die due to these exposures, and this, as I said yesterday, I will say, it's completely unacceptable because all of those deaths, without exception, are preventable. Our second concern, which is also related to this one, and I think that both Marcos and Virgil already addressed this, is that it's most often the most vulnerable population, the most vulnerable groups of workers that are those more affected. We are speaking here of workers in developing economies, workers in the informal economy, and according to our estimates, at least half of the global employment is informal, and we can then think of how to address the specific needs of workers, but also economic units, working in informal economy, when you know that even to address the needs of workers in formal employment relationships, it's already so difficult. When we say that these vulnerable workers deserve special consideration, it's very much due to the fact that quite often some groups are not even covered by applicable legislation. We speak here of migrant workers, we speak here again workers in the informal economy, and when they are within the remit of national legal frameworks, we know, for example, that in developing countries, those specialized services and the expertise that is required to assess the risks of exposure to occupational hazards in general and chemicals in particular, and also to identify the most appropriate measures are almost non-existent. So we saw estimates that we developed a couple of years ago that in the developing world, only around 20% of workplaces are covered by occupational health services. So these figures are really alarming. Well, our hopes is that the recent, more or less recent adoption last year, a new resolution by the International Labour Conference to upscale the importance of occupational safety and health, which is now recognized as the fundamental principle and right at work, meaning a human right within the context of labor, will help us to make progress. And will help us to make progress because now all of our members, including, and I'd say even mostly governments, employers, of course with the collaboration of workers, have very specific obligations. Just by the fact that they are members of the ILO,
they now have to, well, to respect, to promote, and to progressively realize this right to a safe and healthy working environment. What does it mean? It means that national frameworks will have to be adapted to the principles of two of our conventions, Convention number 155 and Convention number 187, which are quite comprehensive. That, for example, require from countries to have national policies addressing, namely, chemical hazards that should be complemented by national strategies or programs, which are also to be comprehensive in terms of addressing all hazards, all groups of workers, all enterprises, all sectors, including the public sector, where we do see some deficits in many countries, and even deficits when it comes to exposure to occupational hazards. And also that very specific measures need to be adopted at the workplace level, and that every single workplace needs to have a system for managing all occupational hazards that may be presented in the workplace, including exposure to chemical, any kind of chemical substance. Then what we are also hoping is that recent developments in terms of just transition, and namely a recent report and conclusions that were adopted this year at our International Labour Conference will also help us to make progress in terms of, well, confirming, and this I think it's very well known, that there's a very close relationship between all that relates to chemicals, the environment, the creation of new jobs in the so-called new green industries. These also can hazards, of their own, and also the fact that so the idea is not only when this resolution was adopted last year. What we are working on now is to prepare a new global strategy for occupational safety and health, a new plan of action where we do ask for multilateral collaboration that will include very specific components on chemical hazards. Also, just one last reference, just also taking advantage of what Virgilia has said, that I think that when it comes to hazards, let me say that we need to consider international ethics. And considering international ethics, because what we need to work on together is to avoid that hazards are exported from one country to the other, from one region to the other. We know that this may happen, from the north to the south. So again, more than, of course, it's important to have binding legal instruments. It's important to have non-binding frameworks, such as the one that will be adopted here this week. But also it's important to encourage the responsibility, due diligence, and the ethical behavior of all those that can assist in avoiding to create exposure to some types of hazards for which, namely in some countries, we may not have the required information available or even the required expertise. So,
thank you very much. I really like to share panels with Joaquin. He's always very clear on the message. And I think he started by saying, like, the numbers are shocking, the evidence is in front of us, and what is worse, it's preventable. And sometimes we hear all this, like, yes, we come to the next topic, but then I think we always need to allow ourselves a moment to sink in and say it's preventable. And also we see in the room, in the negotiations going on, efforts to reopen some discussions that have already been adopted in other forums, just like the right to a safe and healthy work environment, the same to a right to work in health and sustainable environment, and so on. So I think it's also important to reflect some decisions have already been taken, have been adopted by consensus. We need to progress, and progress is showing how. And thank you for showing some ways of how ILO is working with that. And the same way that Santos finished with a question, a request for solidarity, I think yours was similar in the sense of encouraging responsibility, due diligence, and also ethical behavior. This all goes into the work framework also of solidarity and Ubuntu. And now, since we are talking about workers, labor, I'd like to introduce our next speaker, Rory New, from the Labor and Occupational Health Advisor of the International Trade Union Confederation. Rory, as Joaquin has mentioned, workers around the world are facing a global health crisis due to occupational exposure to toxic chemicals. Realistically, what are the paths for alternatives and a just transition for workers? And also, building on the UN guiding principles on business and human rights, what are the obstacles you see as a trade unionist to ensure business enterprise conducts due diligence throughout their supply chain and are held accountable when they fail to do so? Over to you. Easy questions.
I want to give up already. Thank you for inviting us and getting a trade union viewpoint here. I wanted to look at a couple of things. One, the theory about what should happen to protect workers and the reality of what happens. Now we have an enormous swathe of rights, as Joaquin was saying, with the ILO. We have Convention 170, Chemicals Convention 139 on Carcinogens Convention 174 on major accident hazards. The laws are there. We have national laws, we have understanding, we have knowledge. There's a lot of things in place that say workers shouldn't get sick, workers shouldn't get harmed, workers shouldn't die prematurely. But quite instructive was the discussion on the vision that was going on in this conference less than an hour ago. The vision included language, and I'll paraphrase, and I've written it sideways so it might be a bit difficult to read. Chemicals, when not properly managed, can harm people. This was the basis of the language. Now, that was a very, very hard thought of a point. Government after government after government, industry stood up and said it's crucial that chemicals aren't pictured as something that are inherently bad or that they have their uses, they're beneficial. It's when they're not properly managed that that's the problem. Well, that ignores the human rights and political context in which chemicals are used. In reality, laws never say chemicals must not harm you at work. They say things like chemicals must not harm you at work so far as is reasonably practical. They say in the laws that the ILO has in accordance with national practice. Well, these are very loaded expressions. My version of reasonably practicable certainly isn't the same as the company that is producing and profiting from the use of those chemicals. So that's something we have to come back to here. We are looking at the commercial exploitation of chemical sales. Now, that can mean that chemicals can be used for good. It can mean that they're useful in our everyday lives, but it can also mean that the priority of profit is one that profits shareholders, boardrooms, the already privileged, or it can be that it profits the workforce of the community through decent, safe and sustainable work. Well, what I see frequently is the latter not happening. We don't see decent work, we don't see sustainable work, and there are 100 bodies on the pile every year that show that's the case, and that is an undercount. You know, when we look, we can count the bodies that are visible, but we deliberately and consistently miscount and discount. Women barely appear in that death count because they've not been included in the studies where we evaluated risk on chronic hazards like chemicals. Barely there in the literature at all. So we've got an undercount, which is underestimating the risk. And if you don't count the bodies don't count. So the difference between the rights and safety law, which is our little special expert world, and reality is human rights, which is when I'm dealing with occupational health and safety, I say, you can tell me I'm not meant to be exposed. You can tell me I've got a right to information. You can tell me I've got a right to act, and you can tell me I've got a right to refuse. All rights in national laws and in ILO standards. But I have no rights at all unless if I get fired or victimized, lose my job or lose my health as a result of standing up. And this happens routinely. You know, nearly 200 environmental activists murdered every year, despite rights, laws, UN guiding principles, whatever. This means that we need the will and we need to enforce that will through exercising our rights. As was mentioned by some of the speakers before, including Marcos, the reality for us is a lot of the work that is done now by insecure, migrant, outsourced, exploited and vulnerable workers. They don't have access to that law. They don't have access to that system, even though theoretically all the laws we have in the international sphere cover all workers. So the issues we have to address are, I would say at the moment, work should be formalised. Informal labour is exploitation. Workers should have the freedom of association and the right to organise, fundamental rights within the ILO, but something that has to come into the workplace. Workers have to have the right to collective bargaining, so together they can stand and be a voice against the interests of business, which might not always be compatible with their interests. They should have protection from victimisation. They should have access to justice, and there must be a just transition, because a choice between exposure to poisons and exposure to poverty is no choice at all. We need a transition whereby, through state investment, public investment, investment by industry, we move from hazardous production to safe, sustainable and decent work for the good of communities and the planet at large. In our world now, this means that that's got to be in human rights language. It means we've got to reference the UN Guiding Principle. It means that we've got to act when and wherever we can. It can be through procurement, it can be through influencing World Bank or multilateral development ideas. One of the keys for us is the UN Guiding Principles, when we take the issue to companies in due diligence and supply chain responsibility or value chain responsibility. You may assume that major rich multinationals behave really well. You go to their workplaces, on the whole, they may observe the standards of their rich home nation. That tier of responsibility rarely cascades down. You're an example of how badly it works. The most advanced products we use all the time, our mobile phones and computers, are made with minerals that in general are 2 stages down the supply chain, but produced by artisanal miners. Informal miners, child miners in countries in Africa and elsewhere, producing tantalum and indium and minerals like that. Essentially, you know, I can move my finger like that because a child in the Congo is digging the indium can be used to create a screen. Now, how can that happen when those minerals are then bought by a gangmaster, and that gangmaster sells them directly to the multinationals producing the computers and mobile phones? That is a short chain of responsibility that they're neglecting to observe. So we need human rights language to ensure that that sort of supply chain responsibility, that sort of real life health and safety exists. So that's the context for us. We can pretend that health and safety is a thing which is self-contained and out there and it happens. It doesn't happen in isolation. It happens if we have human rights. And to get that means for me as a trade unionist, we have to ensure we build capacity at the grassroots so people can organise. We have to get them the information, but we have to provide them with the support and solidarity to organise there. And it doesn't end there, because the factory that our workers are working in, the mines, are what are polluting the neighbourhoods if they're not properly managed, if it's not properly controlled. So our alliances have to be broader than within the workplace. They have to be within the workplace and outside the workplace. We have to be part of the community, we have to be part of the environmental movement, and we have to be part of the workplace movement. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I think what we are slowly doing is really like drafting an alternative text for ICCM to adopt. Only we wish. So, I mean, you mentioned that the vision being discussed in the room is that chemicals, when not properly managed, can harm people. And the vision should be people and the planet over profit. We need to count the bodies, but also organize. Human rights needs to be referred to. If they are not referred, they're easily disregarded, conveniently forgotten, as this would be possible. And you mentioned something important that wasn't mentioned before, and is the role of environmental human rights defenders, which include workers who are exposing health concerns in their workplace and so on, but they are killed, harassed, lose their jobs, and they are detained, and so on. This we see so much in the world. So I always like to pay respect to the bravery of those who are fighting for a better world. So thank you, Rory. I would like now to move to my left side and over to Saru Rengan, who's the Executive Director of Pesticide Action Network and Asia Pacific. So, highly hazardous pesticides used in agriculture pose a serious risk to human health and the environment. This has then also an impact on human lives. What can be done to address this issue? Is it possible for pesticides to support healthy ecosystems and sustainable agricultural practices? Over to you.
Thank you, Paula. So I just want to also just emphasize the impacts of pesticides because they actually cause 385 million unintended pesticide poisonings every year and an unknown number of long-term effects and over 150,000 pesticide-related suicides. For every one of these numbers, there is a farmer, there is a worker, there is a woman, a family, a child suffering the debilitating impacts of pesticides. They also contribute significantly to all the current global crises, climate disaster, biodiversity loss, and chemical pollution. And they threaten the survival of the planet as we know it. Pesticides violate the rights to health, a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment and livelihoods of farmers, agricultural workers, indigenous people, women, local communities, children, and consumers. These are fundamental rights recognized by the international community. The reality is that on the ground, farmers and agricultural workers use pesticides under perilous conditions. In Pan Asia Pacific's documentation, we have found that many farmers could not read or understand the labels, or they simply do not consult the labels due to a general unawareness of pesticide dangers. Professional PPE or personal protective equipment appropriate for the climate conditions could not and still cannot be obtained in many parts of Asia. So the farmers use and workers use makeshift protective equipment used by some, and they remain very ineffective. In the Philippines, the workers use bra as masks, face masks, and in India they use scarves to cover their heads. Similarly, studies also show that most farmers and farm workers, when asked if they have ever received training on protective measures, they always say, no, they have not. Plantation workers in Indonesia and Malaysia in the oil palm plantations use highly hazardous pesticides without any protection. They spray for 8 hours daily. Many of these workers are women and often on contract and have no health benefits or social protection. And if they fall sick, they bear the cost of medical expenses or they are left to suffer the consequences. In Malaysia, many migrant workers working in precarious conditions, including without proper accommodation, exposure to chemicals, and even their passports are kept by their employers. The labels are often torn by plantation owners so that workers are not aware of what they are spraying or what they're exposed to. Despite being fully aware of the conditions of use prevalent in the farming communities, corporations still sell highly hazardous pesticides. The pesticide industry's myth of safe use is not possible, given the conditions of use in the South. And even though the industry is aware that this of the conditions of use, they continue to sell harmful pesticides. In addition, the export of banned pesticides for reasons of human health and the environment domestically is still allowed, even though the people of the South use these pesticides in really perilous conditions. So when pesticides are banned, the same companies that produce them put a pressure on developing countries to rescind the bans. And it has happened in many instances. Even Thailand was pressured to rescind the bans of 3 pesticides. So there is a lack of accountability of corporations and unethical practices. I also wanted to kind of mention that The commitment to transition away from HHPs or highly hazardous pesticides require ensuring that rural people who feed the world are afforded their basic rights, which includes not just the right to safe working conditions and a clean and healthy environment, but for peasants, the right to land and resources, and the people's right to food sovereignty. In the global south, most of land is controlled by big plantations and landlords, and they get concessions from the government to even log and do monocultures of oil palm, and these are the lands of the indigenous people. Even for those who own land, the profit-oriented food system and neoliberal policies dictate what they should grow, mostly monocultures and cash crops that use a lot of HHPs. Radical transformation of food systems is essential to uphold human rights. For this framework and the reason why we are here, we have been pushing for the harms caused by HHPs to push that as a violation of basic human rights, and to call for redress that will ensure that manufacturers of hazardous pesticides are also held accountable for these harms. And so one of the targets is really to try to eliminate the harm caused by highly hazardous pesticides, and especially the alternatives. So we're calling for a global alliance and supporting the African regions push for a global alliance on highly hazardous pesticides. And we need to have that to move forward to advance the elimination of harm caused by highly hazardous pesticides. Thank you.
Thank you so much, sir. I've learned a lot. And I've met her this week, and that's the second time I hear her speak, and I'm like, I continue learning from you. So thank you. Thank you for highlighting the numbers and for showing that, yes, the numbers hide real people affected by pesticides. Is it a choice that farmers are using highly hazardous pesticides, or are they only choice they think they have? And then thank you also for mentioning the lack of accountability, due diligence, and pointing out that the transition needs to involve rural people, small farmers, indigenous peoples, and that also they need to involve a much broader range of human rights and workers' rights, including their rights to land and food sovereignty. A radical food transformation of food system, I don't think we will manage to achieve in this week. But I think this week can be the start, showing steps that are required to eliminate pesticides from the food chain. And I think the proposal to establish this alliance that is developed by Africa, which I understand is, I hope it gets enough support and goes ahead. So thank you very much. I will now move to Rochelle Diver, who is the UN Environmental Treaties Coordinator at the International Indian Treaty Council. Rochelle, in which ways are indigenous peoples impacted by chemicals? We see there are not many indigenous delegates in this meeting, so please use this as a platform to express and educate us all in this way. And also we appreciate if you could share with us some concrete proposals about how the new framework could adequately reflect the rights of indigenous peoples. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ana Paula. I would like to introduce myself and where I come from, just to give some context. I am an Anishinaabe woman. We are Indigenous peoples in what is now known today as the United States and Canada. Colonization still plagues us. It plagues our food systems. I come from the Great Lakes. My nation is called Fond du Lac Band of Lake Superior, Ojibwe. That really tells you what an essential part the lands and waters play for who we are and in our inherent rights as Indigenous peoples. as I said, we're hunters, fishers, and gatherers, but unfortunately, we're not able to live our traditional subsistence lifestyles anymore because of the constant threat of new contaminants and the contaminants that have already been recognized as harmful to human health. For example, our fish are filled with mercury. Our young women and women of childbearing age can no longer eat the fish out of Lake Superior, which is one of the freshest, which is one of the largest, freshest deep water lakes in the world. It is completely contaminated with PFAS in particular. The fish are filled with mercury. We've got a pipeline going right under my nation. We have a new threat of what they're calling a green innovation mine. So when we hear this term just transition, we really, really need to think about what that means. Is there a way to mine nickel in a clean and healthy way? There's not, but they're calling it a just transition because it's going to move us towards electric cars. There's copper there as well. So it's all the minerals that we really need for what they consider to be a just transition. For my people, it's not just, and it's not a transition. It's more extractives that are going to put more contaminants into our waters and our food systems. And the Great Lakes are part of the 5 Great Lakes of the United States. So that goes all the way over to the Atlantic Ocean. And my state, Minnesota, is the head of the Mississippi River as well. So this is not only our problem, this is everyone's problem. And we have inherent rights as Indigenous peoples. And the international framework where these rights are encompassed is the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. These are rights we never relinquished. We never gave up in the face of colonizers. Although some think that they are rights that were given to us. But we all know that that's not true for any of us. No one can give us rights or take our rights away. They can be upheld or they can be violated. With those examples, I'd like to move in to what can we do? How can we change this trajectory? And how can we fully uphold, respect, and realize the rights of Indigenous peoples in spaces like this? And an example I have is UN Food and Agriculture, actually. In 2010, FAO adopted a policy on Indigenous peoples, affirming the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples as the highest international standard. This specifically regarding free, prior, and informed consent, which is FPIC. Sometimes they like to say consultation, but it's consent, and we need to constantly be reminding them of that. So these are the core principles being recognized by FAO, and FAO acknowledged their responsibility to observe and implement the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. So I was so happy to hear Dr. Oriana talking about how this possibly could be realized through UNEA, UNEP, and all UN environment processes. So we are very committed to working on that as well moving forward. I'd like to call your attention to Article 29 of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. States shall take effective measures to ensure that no storage or disposal of hazardous materials shall take place in the lands or territories of Indigenous peoples without their free, prior, and informed consent. And obviously, this is not being realized. I'm sure you've seen some of the fights that we are having against pipelines going through. I think the Dakota Access Pipeline was the first time that it really made international and mainstream media news. But it is important to say that we are fighting these struggles every single day. I have my position with International Indian Treaty Council, and I'm very thankful and I'm proud to be able to be an advocate. But I have no choice every morning when I wake up that I'm a frontline defender fighting another multinational corporation that wants to contaminate our lands, waters, and food systems, and in turn then the health of our future generations. In this regard with FAO, we all know that houses the UN Rotterdam Convention. which allows for countries to manufacture and export pesticides. So we need to think about who's on the other end of that. I heard in a side event a question by a reporter that says, well, the global north has stated they need to manufacture these chemicals for the global south because they have different climates. They come from tropical places and they need these chemicals. Well, and then the example of one of our nations, the Yaqui Nation, which is in the United States and Mexico. This nation, the colonial border was drawn in between this nation. So we're seeing the manufacture of the chemicals on the United States side, but just across the border being sprayed airily. And so what they're saying is not true. I mean, we're talking 10 kilometers across the border, they're beginning to use these highly hazardous pesticides. So when this disinformation comes out, I think we also need to take it upon ourselves to combat that disinformation and hope that we can halt that disinformation, because once it gets into people's minds, sometimes they hear it just as a fact. So I'm going to wrap up here just to show you how this was possible for us. We used other UN mechanisms, such as the United Nations Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues, to get a recommendation to UNFAO and the World Health Organization, to FAO to amend the Pesticide Code of Conduct to be in line with the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And this is what all of these mechanisms should do. And this is a process here that should be discussing the rights of Indigenous peoples as well. I haven't even heard discussions on FPIC. And we just came out of a negotiating session where one of the most powerful countries in the world said verbatim, we do not support the term, the right to a clean and healthy environment. So with this recommendation, we took it to FAO, who took it to WHO and the JMPM, and we are igniting the process currently to amend the Pesticide Code of Conduct to be in line. So this is going to be our concrete example of how change can be made, and we are going to use this example to every international process, mechanism, agency that we possibly can to follow in the positive footsteps of UNFAO. I'm running out of time a bit, but I do have the actual specific amendments for the Pesticide Code of Conduct. If anyone is interested in that, please approach me. Chimigwich in my language is many things.
Thank you so much. Which I don't know if all of you are having the same feeling as me of truly enjoying this, the being here and hearing what panelists have to say. Thank you, Washa, for making us inquire, like transition from Marcus' latest report to the council. We could say more that if we have time, looked exactly into how the toxicity of these new technologies. Rory mentioned the minerals needed to make our phones and so on. Who is benefiting from that? Just transition from whom? Thank you also for being continuous fighting in a situation that is so imbalanced and the power is so unequal, to make sure Indigenous people's rights are upheld, not recognized, upheld. Thank you also for working hard to break the silence within UN processes, but also within UN organizations to promote the respect for UN TRIP. I will now, last but not least, I should say, I'll move into Gohar Koyanjan, communications specialist of the Armenian Women for Health and Healthy Environment. It's an NGO from Armenia and member of the International Pollutant Elimination Network. Gohar, everyone deserves to live in an environment free of toxic chemicals. However, women tend to face greater levels of exposure to certain toxic chemicals and are disproportionately impacted by harmful chemicals due to biological, social constructed, and occupational factors. How could you summarize the main issues that brought you to ICCM5? And if you could walk us through your experience working in Armenia to combat gender inequalities and enhance women's engagement in policy making and monitoring process around chemicals and waste management.
what is so critical? Why is it so critical to be achieved?
Thank you very much. Thank you for this invitation and the good introduction. Just to add that our NGO is cycle focal point for Armenia and to address chemical and health threats facing the women and their families in Armenia. Our NGO works successfully with the government, participating in national cycle-related discussions, contributing to a number of awareness-raising activities and initiatives to tackling priority issues of concern. And one of those issues is highly hazardous pesticides. Without SEC, this opportunity to work with the government wouldn't have existed. So this is how we approach from the national level, but also by women's organization. And our main focus is to protect the right of women and children to a healthy environment. Based on our experience, we know that empowering women to participate in the lives of their communities by going to the local level, particularly in rural areas, it is key for combating inequalities. And so just to give a brief idea what is Armenia's economy, and the agricultural sector and rural development are the priority areas for our economic development. And however, the potential contribution of women in fostering inclusive rural economic development is underutilized. They are quite well educated, they are motivated, but approximately 35% of employed people are involved in agriculture, of whom more than 50% are women, but of these women, 85% approximately are involved in the non-formal sector. So it means that, and many of them are heading households, which is more likely to be in extreme poverty if a woman is heading household. And these are about 30% of households. So women's limited technical knowledge on agriculture, persistent stereotypes about female leadership capabilities, limit women's self-confidence to pursue decision-making position in the agriculture sector, even if they have a higher education. Distribution of tasks based on gender stereotypes limit women's engagement in higher paid jobs involving the use of machinery and technology. And the traditional ideas, if we go to the families, about household decision-making and division of labor, including child care, it also constrains a woman's engagement. So what to do? We work to advance women's leadership by increasing the access of women to training and information about health threats, as we just mentioned, access to information, and the threats posed by toxic chemicals and involving the most disadvantaged women, and this is the issue of vulnerability. Also to promote gender equality messages by identify and involve male champions, linking positive masculinities to traditional understanding of manhood, also bringing the men into the picture. One of the main challenges that we are dealing with in interacting with women farmers is the issue of pesticides, of course, and particularly the highly hazardous ones. Many of them, of these women, are exposed to HHP, such as glyphosate, chlorpyrifos, working in greenhouses or in their gardens and orchards. In 2020, we conducted a study to analyze HHPs that are used in Armenia and are imported, including from countries where they are banned, and this is the issue of ethics. And we saw that of the pesticides that we analyzed, the active ingredients allowed for use in Armenia, we revealed that 25 of them belong to the carcinogens or possible carcinogens. And it means that this requires investigation of possible connection of increasing morbidity and mortality, which we are facing in the country. In the list of the main causes of mortality in Armenia, malignant neoplasms take second place after diseases of circulatory system. And if we look at the cancers, the prevalence of this cancers among women, the incidence and mortality from cancer of breast, colon, cervix, uterine body is noticeably high. And over the last 30 years, we have noticed that cancer morbidity and mortality rates have increased 2 or 3 times. This can be due to lifestyles, widespread use of chemical products, use of HHPs in agriculture could also be one of such factors. And the vast majority of cases, by the way, of pesticide poisoning are not reported to medical services because the victims very often medicate at home, self-medicate, and they do not report And most poisoning cases occur in the agricultural provinces of Ararat and Armavir. And I would like now to invite you to one of these provinces, to Armavir, because these are just dry numbers. And how behind these dry numbers are real lives of real women and their families. I just would like to share a story of a woman that we met when we were doing awareness raising, training for women working in greenhouses. And we met there a woman whose name was Anahita Tevusa. She was 42 years old, and she had a child who was born, a boy child, in 2013, and the following year she lost her husband to cancer. And then she took the child to, it was difficult to earn living, she went to the capital here and worked in the candy factory. And then at the age of 3, the child started showing behavior problems, and the boy was diagnosed with autism. And the woman was not able to live with this boy in the city because he had behavior problems. So she needed some support from her extended family. So she came back to her village of Arvix, that is in Armavir region, and she now lives with her brother and brother's family. And what she's doing, she's in agriculture, she works in the greenhouse, in her garden, and what she's using pesticides. How she's using them, she's not wearing protective equipment. Although she knows about it, but it has to be reminded all the time. And just she shared the story of her marriage. Before she got married, her husband worked with his father, again in a greenhouse, etc. They were using pesticides, and both of them lost their lives to cancer. And now she thinks that perhaps both her husband's cancer and her child's autism are somehow linked to the use of pesticides. And I ask myself why I'm here. And I can clearly see that I'm here to bring the voice of Anahit and other hardworking, strong, and at the same time desperate women who are looking at us in search of solutions that could ensure the protection from toxic chemicals that are impacting them, but above all, they're impacting the lives of their loved ones and their cherished environment. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Farah. Thank you for bringing these voices. Unfortunately, we need to be reminded that women, the impact of chemicals on women and still living in a very unequal world, gender-wise. We are running out of time, and I think I have a solution for how to wrap up in a way that everybody can feel part of this event. I'm going to ask each one, starting from the panel, and I will go from my left to the right. And then I'm going to ask you also in the audience, one word, can be true if it's human rights. The question is, from a human rights perspective, what is required to ensure that the new framework has the level of ambition needed to confront the global toxic tide? So, one word or two.
One word, global alliance for HHPs and robust funding.
Okay, accent.
I will say responsibility. I think not only individuals, but the corporations, everyone that is speaking, I think first and foremost, they need to think, what is their responsibility?
For me, it would be non-chemical alternatives, particularly agroecology and the rights of farmers for a pesticide-free world. Thank you.
Enjoy life, let the others live.
I would highlight global morality and the right to a non-toxic environment.
All human rights are interconnected, and the new framework should recognize this is the fact.
Right.
Really rubbish and one word answer though.
Glad I was not able to say.
I'm going to go with organisation. And the reason I said organisation is nothing good will happen unless we make it happen. And we won't make things happen unless we collaborate and work together in an organised way.
Anyone in the audience that would like to say that one word or two, maybe 3 or 4? Yes.
please, I will start from the front, going all the way back.
Yeah.
Yes.
I would say monitoring and surveillance is a target which was suggested, and it is, I believe this gives the power to the people who suffer from the exposure. And it's helps to support this.
Going second line. Well, the last, let's say, next line.
Say my leadership and stories, but my word was solidarity.
Another line. Anyone on the next line? Last line is the most active.
We would like that. So fully agree on responsibility, but also be reminded that people also need to have effective solutions to produce the food that we all eat, to produce the clothes that we all eat, to sit on the chairs we sit on, you know. Chemicals do have a benefit. I agree. The risks need to be transparent. They need to be properly assessed, and risks need to be effectively mitigated.
Moving to the side. Sorry, to the other side. There was a hand.
Oh.
Then we go in. Now we move a little bit from.
So I'm from UNICEF, so thank you for thanking everybody for the wonderful contributions to this conversation. So I would, 2 words, so I would 3. Children are watching. In fact, to summarize it, accountability.
Thank you very much. And then we had another hand in front.
Yeah, I think that supporting the solutions that already exist, I want to echo Sarah in saying that the non-chemical alternatives like agroecology is something that we need to be centered and uplifted at the framework.
And one more hand, yes?
I think, so I represent an investment organization, so from our perspective, corporate accountability and remediation of harm for rights holders.
And I think with that note, especially coming from that sector, I think we are good to finish this panel, kind of wrapping up. And I would just like to, make it loud because we are not that many. Clap our hands and just thank everybody for their contribution today. Let's make it count in the rooms.
Thank you.